day to everyone joining us, and welcome to today's X Talks webinar. Today's talk is entitled Discrete Choice Experiment, How to Run a Preference Study with the DCE Methodology. My name is Sonia Hunt, and it's my pleasure to be your X Talks moderator for today. At this point, I'd like to thank Carenity, who developed the content for this presentation. Carenity is a leading digital social platform supporting 500,000 patients and caregivers worldwide across 1,000 plus illnesses. Carenity's mission is to empower patients so they can share their experience with other patients living with the same conditions, find information, manage their illnesses, and advance medical knowledge by participating in online research studies. With its innovative platform, Carenity, the patient's insight company, delivers timely and compliant direct-to-patient research solutions to the life sciences industry that fuel the development of better medicines and services. Carenity is based in Paris, France, that is a part of Epidemiologist, an international clinical data science group with offices around the world. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to your speakers for today's webinar. And first, I'd like to introduce you to Lise Radoszycki. She's the Chief Operating Officer at Carenity. She oversees and coordinates the actions of the data science team, which produces real-world studies along with all digital projects and strategy to grow and engage the platform's community. She co-chairs Carenity's Scientific and Ethics Committee. Lise is a method and models statistics engineer. Now it's my pleasure to introduce you to your second speaker, and she is Nawal Bent-Ennakhil. She's the lead epidemiologist at Takeda. Nawal is an epidemiologist by training. She has been leading real-world evidence projects for more than 10 years now. She's held several positions within HEOR, HEOR, and RWE teams. Nawal has been closely managing the DCE preference study project with Carenity. Now, before I pass over the mic and the controls to our first speaker, Liz, we have our first poll question, actually 2 poll questions for our audience members to engage in. Now, this is done in real time, so your participation is strongly encouraged and very much appreciated. I'm going to launch the poll right now, and you see it appear in front of you on your screen. So all you have to simply do is just click on any of the answers below. And the question that we have for you today is, have you ever conducted a DCE study? So please choose one of the below, yes or no. I'll give a few more seconds for those of you who have not cast your votes. If you could do so now, I'd greatly appreciate that. Perfect. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating in the poll question. Now I'm going to close the polls, and let's take a look at the results. Okay, so poll question number 1 was, have you ever conducted a DCE study? And the results are here. We have 29% that said yes, and then we have 71% actually that said no. So thank you everyone for participating in that poll question. Now I'm going to go on to poll question number 2. And this one here we'll do just like we did before in real time, so your participation is strongly encouraged. The question that we have for you is, do you plan to launch a DCE study in the next 12 months? And once again, it's just a simple yes or no, just by clicking on the answers below. Okay, it looks like we have the majority of our audience members have cast their votes, so thank you very much for that. I'll just leave a few more seconds here for those of you who have not. Okay, it looks like everyone has done so. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much, everyone, for participating in that last poll question. I'm now going to share the results with you. Okay, so the question again was, do you plan to launch a DCE study in the next 12 months? And we have 35% that said yes, and then 65% that said no. So thank you, everyone, for participating in those 2 poll questions. And now it's my pleasure to pass over the mic and the controls over to our first speaker, Lise. So Lise, before you begin, what do you think about the results of the poll question?
Okay, so yeah, we have seen that we have 30% of the attendees who have already conducted to DCE, so congrats. And we have 35% who plan to launch a DCE this year. So then my goal with this presentation is to convince the 65% of you who have never done a DCE to go for it and embark on the adventure. And for those who are going to do a DCE this year, I will try to share some tips to improve the quality of your study. So I will start with the presentation. Over the past decade, we have observed a rise in patients' power and engagement regarding their own care. The concept of evidence-based medicine has also emerged with the objective of delivering the right care at the right time to the right patient. One of the core concepts of evidence-based medicine is patient preference. Industry, regulators, HTA bodies, and payers are showing more and more interest in the use of patient preference studies. The objective is to help incorporate the patient perspective into clinical drug development, care management, and healthcare decision-making. In this context, most of the pharmaceutical companies want to be patient-centric, but it's not always clear how and when to include the patient perspective into the product development cycle. If we look at the medical product life cycle at the right side of the slide, we can see that patient preference studies can be incorporated at each step of the medical drug development. I won't detail the whole cycle, but I share some examples. During the discovery phase, we can use patient preference studies to identify patients' unmet needs or design target product profiles. Later, during the clinical development phase, we can optimize clinical trial design by identifying the most valuable endpoints of patient-reported outcomes. During HTA, we can use patient preference studies to weight outcomes or support economic evaluation, such as cost-effectiveness analysis. Finally, during the post-marketing phase, assessing patient preference might be used for having an extension of indication or for marketing innovation. The objective of today's training is to provide an overview of preference study methodologies focusing on the DCE. We will also share our experience on how to optimize DCE design to improve the quality of your patient studies. Patient preference information is defined by the FDA as qualitative or quantitative assessment of the relative desirability or acceptability to patient of specified alternatives or choices among outcomes or other attributes that differ among alternative health interventions. In other words, patient preference information reflects what treatment attributes matter to patients, how much this matters to patients, and how patients make trade-offs between treatment attributes. Describing trade-offs allows to evaluate compromises done by patients when they select their preferred treatment option. To illustrate these concepts, I will ask you 3 questions. Do you prefer to be rich or to be poor? I guess that most of you will answer rich. In the same way, if I ask you, do you prefer to be sick or to be healthy? Again, the answer is easy. You will mostly say healthy. Now, if I ask you, do you prefer to be rich and sick or poor and healthy? The choice is more complicated and you will need to make some compromises or trade-off. For each of these 3 types of information, qualitative or quantitative methodologies exist. Qualitative methods are mainly based on focus groups or semi-structured interviews, whereas quantitative methods are mainly based on questionnaires administered directly to patients. Among the quantitative methods, there are 2 main types of methodologies, the revealed preference methods and the stated preference methods. Revealed preference techniques use observations on real choices made by respondents. These methods are not always adapted to healthcare objectives, especially if we want to evaluate a treatment that is not yet on the market or a drug that targets a restricted population of patients, such as rare disease or a specific disease subtype. On the contrary, stated preference methods are widely used in healthcare. In this type of methods, the subject is asked how much they value something. The Discrete choice experiment, or DCE, is a stated preference method increasingly used in healthcare to elicit patient preferences. In a DCE, participants are asked to state their preferred choice between several competing treatment alternatives. In general, there are 2 treatment options. The features of these treatments are called attributes, and each attribute is decomposed into levels. Each treatment alternative presented to participants is a combination of treatment attributes and levels. The question asked to patients might be, if you were offered these 2 treatments, which one would you choose? On the right side of the slide, you can see an example of choice offered to patients between two alternatives. Each alternative contains 4 attributes, such as occurrence of serious adverse events or pain relief after 1 hour. You can notice that the levels are presented in 2 ways, visual and textual, to reduce uncertainty caused by health numeracy. Before presenting the main steps of a DCE, I would like to insist on 3 questions you should ask yourself before launching a preference study. First, which research question is best suited for the strategic objectives to be achieved by measuring patient preferences? My first advice for defining a research question is to think carefully about the use of the results and what you want to demonstrate. A good research question should be clear and focused on a single topic or on several closely related ideas. It should not be too broad and not too easy to answer. The main types of research questions are descriptive, comparative, or causal. The second question you should ask yourself is, which study population would be most appropriate to answer the defined research question? The target population for a study is highly dependent on the research question being asked. For example, you may want to focus a study on patients eligible to your future treatment, or you may want to have a broader scope in order to allow comparisons between different patient profiles. When choosing the selection criteria, it's also important to take into account potential selection bias and logistic considerations such as data collection time, data collection costs, response rates, etc. Finally, the last question is, what is the most appropriate methodology to answer the research question while considering the operational constraints? Even if the DCE is considered as a gold standard, it is not always the most appropriate methods. Indeed, it is important to highlight that the main guidelines on preference studies published by the NICE, the FDA, or ISPOR do not impose a particular methodology, but propose criteria for assessing the quality of patient studies. For example, if the objective is to evaluate preferences regarding several topics, such as quality of life, care pathway, the impact of a symptom on quality of life, so DCE is not the most appropriate methodology. Same if you want to evaluate the perception of a specific treatment option. It is also very important to take into account the operational constraints, such as the prevalence of the study population, the timelines, the budget allocated to the study, etc. Now I will present you the 5 key steps of a DCE study. The first step in conducting a DCE is to identify the attributes of the treatment. This step involves literature reviews and qualitative research, such as in-depth interviews and focus groups involving patients, physicians, and policymakers. Qualitative research is not mandatory, but the DCE literature is increasingly recognizing the importance of this type of work. The number of attributes to include in the DCE is important. If too many attributes and levels are included, there will be a risk that individuals do not consider all the information and adopt simple decision-making strategies, such as always choosing the option with the highest efficacy. If this is the case, estimated trade-offs will not be valid. So the question you will ask is, what is too many attributes? In general, the number of attributes is between 5 and 8. I personally recommend to investigate the acceptable number of attributes within the pilot work, as this is likely to be context-specific. The main categories of treatment attributes are benefits, such as efficacy, disease remission, symptoms relief, etc. The second one is risk, for example, severe adverse event, moderate adverse event, occurrence of hospitalization, type of adverse events. And the last one is treatment modalities. For example, route of administration, frequency of administration. We can also specify several treatment modalities in the same attributes. For example, a level could be a treatment administered at home twice a week with self-administered injection. The second step in conducting a DCE is to identify the levels of each attribute. The methods used are the same as for the definition of the attributes: literature research, qualitative interviews. Levels may be continuous or categorical. When using categorical variables, it is important to define clearly what is meant by the levels in order to avoid differing interpretation among respondents. Indeed, they should be interpreted by respondents in the same way than those who design the questionnaire. Definition can be added at the beginning of the questionnaire or within each choice to clarify the meaning of the labels and the levels. Researchers often define attributes and levels within realistic levels that are potentially actionable by policy. It is possible to include in the DCE treatment options that are not available on the market, but we recommend to make sure they are credible and realistic. In general, it is impossible to present respondents with all the choices of hypothetical DCE scenarios, what we call in statistics a full factorial design. Experimental design methods are used to select a reduced sample of choices. It's what we call fractional factorial design. To create the experimental design, it is important to follow as much as possible 4 criteria. First, orthogonality, meaning that there should be a minimal correlation between different attribute levels. Then, each attribute should appear approximately an equal number of times in the DCE. It's what we call level balance. 2 scenarios that appear together in a choice set should rarely have the same attribute level. It's what we call the minimal overlap. The fourth criteria is utility balance. Utility is the equation that models the fact that an individual will choose the treatment with given characteristics. It refers to balancing the utility of the alternative offers in the choice set. In practice, the lack of prior information on the utility of attributes limits the applicability of this criteria. However, the first step to ensure utility balance is to eliminate the obvious choices. During the design definition, you also have to choose if you want an opt-out option, meaning the possibility of choosing neither of the 2 alternatives. You also have to choose if you want a fixed option, for example, when you want to include a specific treatment among the 2 alternatives, and this specific treatment will appear in all choices. Then you have to choose the number of choices a respondent should answer to not become tired or bored. In general, the mean number of choices per participant varies from 12 to 18. Again, the pilot study is useful to validate the study design from a patient perspective. The fourth step in statistical modeling. Statistical analysis of DCE data is based on the random utility model. In this framework, a respondent is assumed to choose between alternatives, opting for the one associated with the highest utility, U. Beta coefficients provide quantitative information on the importance of each attribute level. There are 3 main types of models and methods. First, methods that aim to estimate preference weight and attributes relative importance. The most used is the conditional logit regression model, also called C-logit, but other methods are available, such as hierarchical bias or random parameters logit. With this type of model, you can identify how individuals trade between attributes and calculate the probability of individuals choosing a treatment with specified attributes. The second type of models allow to identify groups of respondents with homogeneous treatment preferences. This group of patients are called latent classes, and the individual preferences are similar within groups and dissimilar between groups. The third type is the estimation of the willingness to pay. If price is included as an attribute, respondents make trade-offs between price and other attributes. Therefore, willingness to pay can be indirectly estimated, which may elicit more realistic estimates than contingent valuation surveys that ask respondents directly for their willingness to pay. On the right side of the slide, You can see some example of how we can represent DCE results in order to highlight which attributes are important and how important one attribute is in comparison to another attribute. On the second graph, you can see which levels are the most important for a given attribute. On the bottom right, you can see different patient profiles having the same preferences in terms of treatment. Groups of patients are defined based on social demographic and medical data, such as age, gender, past or current treatments. Finally, I would like to share with you 4 tips to improve the quality of your next DCE studies. First, make sure your participants fully understand the study materials to reduce uncertainty caused by health numeracy or literacy. For this purpose, you can use a pilot study or cognitive debriefing to pretest the questionnaire and the material associated with the study with a limited number of patients. It is also recommended to use several formats simultaneously, including graphical representations of numerical information, as shown in the beginning of the presentation. The second advice is ensure representativeness of the sample and generalizability of results. There are several methods to improve the quality of collected data. For example, by mixing recruitment sources or implementing quotas at inclusion. There are also statistical methods for adjusting the sample after data collection. Finally, it is very important to calculate the accurate sample size to answer the research question. In order to improve the quality of the results, it is important to minimize the potential cognitive biases, such as framing bias, anchoring bias, ordering or labeling effects, or simplified heuristics. It is very important to be aware of potential biases when designing the study in order to name the attributes, items, and alternative options as neutrally as possible. This way, you reduce framing and labeling effects. During the pilot phase, it is important to validate the number of items and the number of choices to avoid anchoring or heuristic biases. The final tip is to think carefully about the statistical analysis plan and data management plan in order to ensure logical soundness and robustness of data analysis. For this, it is important to test the programming of the questionnaire and to verify that procedures put in place can ensure data integrity. After collecting the data, it is interesting to perform a quality check to verify data consistency. When defining the analysis plan, it is also important to identify potential sources of uncertainty in order to put in place adequate preventive measures. It can also be interesting to perform a sensitivity analysis to evaluate results robustness. I believe that you now have all the keys to successfully launch a preference study. So now I leave the floor to Nawal, who will share her experience on the study we conducted together.
Yes, thank you very much, Lise, and I hope you can see my screen. So thank you very much for having me here, and I'm very happy to share my experience on working with Carenity on a patient preference study using a DCE methodology. So I'd like to start with some background in order to explain you the context and why we have decided to run a DCE study. So the context was the launch of a new formulation for vedolizumab in Europe. So providing, in addition to the IV option, a greater choice and enhancing the patient experience in line with their treatment preferences and lifestyles. So in the context of this new treatment option, data on patient preferences are really valuable, and DCE methodology is a well-accepted approach to evaluate patient preferences. And it's also very recognized by important stakeholders like HTA agencies such as IQWiG, NICE, and IQWiG in Germany, NICE in the UK, and HAS in France. So a German study has been set up by our colleagues in order to assess preferences among a representative sample of patients with Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis towards pharmaceutical therapies in Germany. And other countries across Takeda logs have expressed also their interest in using such methodology to support the launch of a new formulation. So in terms of study objectives and research questions, so our key purpose was really to evaluate patient preference for attributes of IBD treatment with a focus on administration route, and better understand what are the key drivers of preference of among IBD patients using a DCE. Our research questions were, for example, how do patients with IBD, so IBD inflammatory bowel disease, evaluate different characteristics of a therapy? How do patients assign worth to administration route as compared to other treatment aspects such as efficacy, tolerability? And can we identify some groups within the patient population, for example, to identify different patient patterns, and what are the important factors impacting on preference for a different administration route? So you have here an overview of the project plan. So with first qualitative research. So the first step was really to identify the attributes and relevant levels. And this has been done by our colleagues in Germany through literature reviews and also with the help of clinical experts. And then the second step was to select the attributes and levels, to finalize the list of attributes and levels. So this has been done with qualitative patient interviews and also here with clinical experts. Regarding the designing phase, so this is really about developing the protocol, the screener, and the patient questionnaire, and from Carenity side to the experimental design in order to ensure statistical efficiency. Then we have the data collection with patient recruitment via the Carenity patient panel, and questionnaire completion from the patients, data analysis. So this has been done with different waves, like first descriptive statistics in order to better understand the study population and some key factors, and DCE models really with the relative preferences of the different attributes. And then we had also some analysis in order to identify the subgroups with a latent class analysis. And then we have a final stage with reporting and also publications. A very important consideration is really ethics and compliance aspects. So at the beginning of the project, actually during the contracting, there has been a robust assessment via a detailed questionnaire of the vendor and better understand how they process the data. And at this stage, no privacy impact assessment was deemed necessary by our colleagues from ethics and compliance. Our colleagues from ethics and compliance have also reviewed the language in the different agreements. And final point regarding the data privacy and security. So, as usual, data are collected anonymously and in aggregate form, so it doesn't allow any personal identification. Regarding ethics and IRB reviews, so this type of project, so patient surveys, represents no or minimal risk to patients. So usually they are, it's not within the IRB scope. But internally, there has been a detailed review from medical affairs and also from legal within the internal Takeda process. And also externally, we had also the support of a steering committee, also looking at the protocol and reviewing also the patient questionnaire. For the patient information and consent, so pre-consent, the patients have been informed about the survey, who is the sponsor, how the data will be used, and their rights regarding data protection and the possibility to withdraw their consent at any time during the data collection. The consent of the patient has been formalized by a checkbox, so for in order to be sure that they are willing to participate to the survey, and that we can process the information that we will provide. In this case, there has been no financial compensation of patients. We have collaborated with patient advocacy leads in order to see how we can motivate them to participate to the survey. And we have used some communication tools like infographics in order to increase the participants' interest. In terms of methodological aspects, so I wanted also to summarize maybe some key things. So recruitment methodology. So as earlier mentioned, patients have been recruited through Carenity online panel, also the partners panel and Facebook users. So as mentioned by Lise, so it's important also to have to really reflect on the selection criteria. So we wanted to use broad selection criteria in order to ensure sample representativity. So mainly self-reported with ulcerative colitis or Crohn's disease, and also we wanted to be sure that they have been treated for their disease, so currently or in the past. The sample size was 600, so 300 per disease, and we have 7 countries who have participated to the survey. So it's a cross-sectional study, and the patient questionnaire has been validated by the steering committee. For the data collection, so we have collected information on socio-demographics, lifestyle factors, the disease characteristics, treatment management, including previous and current treatments, and obviously the core piece was the DCE exercise, but we have also added some questions around the impact of Crohn's disease or ulcerative colitis on quality of life. 2 key things here for the patient questionnaire. So one, it's to ensure that the questions are worded appropriately, so using a patient-friendly language. And second, really to make sure that the questionnaire is not too long, so to avoid the respondent burden. So it was like 20 minutes approximately in order to complete the questionnaire. So this is an example of a screen for the DCE exercise. So as you can see, patients were provided with 2 options corresponding to 2 combinations of 5 attributes with different levels. And based on their selections and decisions, so we could quantify the relative preferences and also understand how they trade off between the attributes. So I'm not going to go into a lot of details. It has been very well explained by Lise. And just wanted also to give you some rough timelines when running this kind of project. So as you can see, the data collection was relatively short, so 3 months. And so this was a very nice thing with this project. So we could obtain results in a timely fashion. So we could have some results delivered like 2 months after the end of data collection, and we have reviewed them in details with the steering committee the following month. So how we have used the results, so it's mainly for a publication purpose. So we have presented already some set of results at different conferences, so mainly conferences in IBD and in Europe, so ECHO and UAGW. And also we are going to present also some results at ISPOR Europe, since patient research is a really key topic for ISPOR. And we are planning also to develop a manuscript based on the results. And just wanted also to highlight maybe the members of the steering committee. And I think it was very interesting to have the participation of a nurse here in order also to have to better understand the patient perspective and to make sure that that the patient questionnaire is really taking into account the patient perspective. So the help of a nurse was really valuable in this project as well. And with that, I think it's the final slide. So I thank you very much for your attention, and I hand over to Sonia for the poll questions.
Thank you very much, Nawal and Lise, for that very insightful and detailed presentation. And just like Nawal said, it's now time for poll question number 3, our final poll question for this webinar. So I've launched it. You should see it in front of you, just like before. It's done in real time, so your participation is strongly encouraged and very much appreciated. So please pick one of the below, yes or no. The question is, do you plan to launch a DCE study in the next 12 months? Okay, that looks like it's the majority of our audience members. I'll leave a few more seconds as I see people are still choosing their answers below. Okay, that looks like it's the majority of everyone. Okay, thank you everyone for participating. I'm now going to close the polls and share the results with everyone. Okay, so the results are here. The question was, do you plan to launch a DCE study in the next 12 months? And we have 55% that said yes and 45% that said no. So thank you everyone for participating in that final poll question. Now we're going to begin the Q&A portion of the webinar. And for that, I will ask our speakers, Nawal and Lise, to put on their cameras, as well as Karine. And now you'll notice that Karine here is joining us. Karine Adouar, she's a Global Sciences Director and Head of RWE at Carenity, the Patients Insight Company, Evident IQ Group. So she's here to answer your questions. So if you have any questions, please use that questions window and send them through, and we'll try to attend to your questions during the time that we have together. So I have already received a bunch of questions from our audience members, so I'm going to begin with those questions. So let me just make sure that our speakers are ready. Lise, Karine, and Nawal, are you ready for the first question? Okay, here it is. This audience member is asking, this looks like it's for you, Nawal. Did the DCE study launch with team meet your objectives? Overall, are you happy with collaboration?
Yes. So yes, as mentioned during the presentation, so the key objectives were really to quantify relative preferences, and so yes, so we have results really, showing and quantifying the patient preferences for the different attributes. So yes, the research has, we have met our objectives, and I would like to insist in a very timely fashion. So it was really important for us as well.
Okay, thank you very much, Nawal, for that. Here's our next question. It looks like it may be for Lise. This question is, how to determine the accurate sample size for a DCE? This audience member is asking.
This is a very good question. When we look at the literature, we notice that the sample size and calculation methods vary a lot from one publication to another. However, researchers have shown that in all DCE studies with efficient designs, model or estimate precision increase at sample size greater than 150 and then flattens out around 300. Again, it is important to take into account the research question. The minimum sample size needed for DCE depends on the specific hypothesis to be tested. So if you want to develop models by subgroup, my recommendation is to have at least 150 patients for each subgroup.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Lise. Here's our next question. This audience member is asking, do patient preference studies really make a difference in regulatory decision-making? Who would like to answer that one? Or is that a question for Lise?
Okay, this is again a very interesting question. Several authorities such as NICE or FDA invite companies to start a conversation with them about using patient preference information to support their submission. Over the past years, several guidelines and initiatives have been developed to implement and improve quality standards, such as the PREFER initiative or IMI. There is therefore a real desire to include patient studies in regulatory decision-making. Nevertheless, the level of consideration given to this type of study is very variable and highly depends on the quality of the study. For example, Janssen included in its dossier a preference study to support esketamine, a treatment for treatment-resistant depression, TRD. And the objective of this DCE study was to assess the patient perspective on benefits-risk trade-offs. In their HTA dossier, outcomes importance was reinforced by the results of the patient study. And the advisory committee of the FDA said that it has been influential in their decision, but we do not know how much it has been influential.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much for that very detailed answer there, Lise. Here's our next question. This audience member is asking, as a representative of a pharmaceutical company, in which cases would you recommend a patient study? Who would like to take that question?
So, as a representative of a pharmaceutical company, so in which case do you recommend a DCE or patient survey? Sorry, a DCE, right?
They said, as a representative of a pharmaceutical company, in which cases would you recommend a patient study?
A patient study, so not specific to DCE. So I think it's very important to capture the patient perspective. Now it's really not only in order to answer, questions from HT agencies, for which a patient perspective is a very important consideration for their decision making, but also for the physicians, so to better understand the patient perspective. So yeah, it's a very so usually we run this type of patient studies, very early in the drug development, so to better understand the burden of the disease from patient perspective, humanistic burden of disease, impact on the quality of life. So this is becoming more and more important for the pharmaceutical companies to run such studies, collecting the insights from patient perspective.
Okay, all right. Thank you very much, Nawal, for answering that. Here is our next question. This audience member is asking, have you run other types of patient studies, and what did the DCE approach provide compared to others? This probably is for you, Nawal.
Okay, so the DCE, as explained by Lise, so it's really about understanding how the patients trade off between the different treatment attributes, between different aspects or concepts. So when you have such questions, obviously the DCE is very interesting. So in the context of the launch of a new formulation, it can be very important to collect this information, because it's really dependent on patient acceptability. So some patients will prefer different routes of administration. So in general, in the context of the launch of a new formulation, it's very important to run a DCE. But I would say that even in order to better understand how they assess the different aspects of the disease, so to assess the unmet needs, of a particular disease from patient perspective, I think also DCE can be suitable to answer this kind of questions.
Okay, thank you very much for that, Nawal. Here's our next question. How long does it take to do a DCE, and how much does it approximately cost? Who would like to answer that, Lise?
Yes, I think now we'll share our experience with the study we run together. This is always difficult to answer this type of question, since every single study project is unique, and timeline and obviously budget are mostly driven by the number of patients, the geographical scope, and the selected methods. The more complex it is, the more impact it has on budget and timing. In general, the overall project, qualitative and quantitative phases, usually last around 18 months, with a cost that could go up to 500k euros or more. It's true that among patient studies and preference studies, DCE projects are the longest and most expensive due to strong and robust methodological requirements.
Okay, thank you very much, Lise. Here's our next question. This audience member is asking, would you recommend a study that looks at different routes of administering a drug, or is this something you can find out through patient organizations and speaking to patients directly? Who would like to answer that question?
Nawal, maybe?
Yes.
Nawal? Okay.
So directly to patient organizations, I'm not sure I understood the question. So yeah,
I can repeat it for you.
Sure.
See if we can make this up. Would you recommend a study that looks at different routes of administering a drug, or is it something you can find out through patient organizations and speaking to patients directly?
Yeah, it's important, I think, to collaborate with a patient organization. I think most of them are really willing to participate to this kind of research, including understanding what are the preferences for route of administration. So I think here the idea of our project was really to understand how the patients trade off between the different routes of administrations and frequency of administrations with other treatment aspects such as efficacy and safety. So yeah, so I think you can collaborate directly with patient organizations if you want if you want to better understand what are the preferences in terms of route of administrations. But I would advise to use a DCE methodology when you want to put that in the context of other treatment aspects such as safety and efficacy.
Okay. Thank you very much. Maybe, oh, go ahead, Lise. You sound like you want to add something. Go ahead.
Add something. I think both can be combined in the same project, and it was a case when we worked together with Nawal. We involved some patient organization to support patient recruitment and also for the diffusion of results. So we can have some project with really strong methodologies such as DCE, and also benefit this project to involve patient organization. We can involve patients during the qualitative phase to define attributes, or during the questionnaire development as well. So yeah, I think we can have both at the same time.
Yes.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Here's our next question. What study method is most appropriate in understanding patient preference in DCE? And do you treat biases? Thank you. And then they said thank you.
Studying patient preference in DCE. There is a lot of biases. I show some biases in my slide, and for each bias we have a specific method. So for example, I can give you one example, labeling effect. So for example, we know, and it is quite well documented, that if you name each treatment option, for example, treatment A or treatment B, it has an influence on the patient answer. So for example, if you put first treatment, second treatment, maybe some patient will be influenced by the fact that you put a 1 versus a 2 for the other option. So we have several methods to avoid this type of labeling effect. So for example, in the study with Nawal, we decided to have only treatment A, treatment B, so there is a less hierarchy. And we can also, when we provide the choice to patients, mix the choices. So some patients see the treatment A and the others see treatment B instead of treatment A. And I don't know if I'm clear, but just to say that for each type of bias, we will have specific method to try to avoid this bias.
Okay, thank you very much. I think you answered that completely. Okay, this looks like it's our final question, and this looks like it's for you, Lise. This audience member is asking, you have depicted an example of collaboration on a DCE. Do you have any other types of capabilities like data linkage or RWE studies?
So yeah, we have a network of partners to allow hybrid study, combining data from Carenity to external EMR data sources. So these projects based on data linkage could be interesting, especially in rare diseases, to capture patient journey during the delayed diagnosis, or more broadly to fine-tune understanding on treatment adherence, for example.
Okay, thank you very much. And I think I brought up the slide here that you wanted to reference. Is this any help to you?
Yes.
A little more detail?
So yeah, Carenity is a provider of patient insight from a real-world setting. So unlike other RWE providers, Carenity is not stepping into existing data sets. Instead, Carenity is able to define the best specific project with the appropriate methodology to answer its partner objectives. Numerous applications for patient insights generation exist, and patient preference is one of them, but Carenity is also working on projects aiming, for example, to better understand burden of disease or assess unmet needs. And patient project typology is almost endless. The methodology we can apply are also robust and diverse, and range from cross-sectional survey to longitudinal ones using some e-diaries. And since we are working with patient insight generation, we are obviously very familiar with e-patient reported outcomes, which are some validated scales or questionnaire we can use to make sure that we have a validated measure for outcomes.
Okay, thank you very much. Okay, all right, well, that looks like it's the last of our questions here, so I wanted to say thank you to the audience members for sending in those questions. I know there's a couple of them here we could not attend to, so I'm sure the team at Carenity will follow up with you after this presentation. Now, if you have any further questions, please direct them to the email address that's on your screen, and you see it there, pro@carenity.com. Okay, thank you everyone for participating in today's webinar. You will be receiving a follow-up email from X-Talks with access to the recorded archive for this event. A survey window will be popping up on your screen. Your participation is appreciated, as it will help us to improve on our further webinars. Now, in a few seconds, I'm going to send you a link in your chat box. You'll be able to view the recording of this event at that link, and also share this link with your colleagues when they register for the recording as well. So I encourage you to do that. Now, please join us in thanking our speakers, Lise and Nawal, and for Karine sitting in to answer any of the questions that came through for the Q&A portion of the webinar. So thank you very much, everyone.
Yes, thank you.
Bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. We hope you found this webinar informative. It has been my pleasure to be your webinar moderator. On behalf of the team here at X-Talks, we thank you for joining us. I'm Sonia Hunt. Until next time, please take care and bye for now. Bye. Thank you, everyone. Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.